In the heart of an ancient and secluded land, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests whose trees whispered secrets older than memory itself, there existed a kingdom that had thrived for centuries under the careful stewardship of its rulers, yet whose very existence remained shrouded in shadows for those who lived beyond its borders. The kingdom was vast, its sprawling citadels perched atop rocky cliffs that overlooked winding rivers, whose waters glimmered like molten silver under the rising and setting sun, carrying with them the tales of merchants, travelers, and messengers who had once passed through its lands and had returned with stories, fragmented and mysterious, of grandeur, wisdom, and the silent weight of history. Within the walls of the capital, the palace rose like a monumental labyrinth, its towers reaching skyward, adorned with banners that fluttered in the evening breeze, each symbol and emblem a reminder of the lineage that had maintained order, justice, and the unspoken codes that bound the people to their sovereign. The king, the last in a line whose roots seemed entwined with the very stones of the palace, was a figure both enigmatic and commanding, a man whose presence evoked reverence, curiosity, and in quiet corners, the faintest traces of unease. In the weeks before his disappearance, he had been seen walking alone in the palace gardens during twilight, his gaze distant, as though he perceived a world hidden beyond the veil of what was visible to others, contemplating matters that no one could fully grasp. Courtiers whispered of subtle changes in his demeanor, moments of silence stretching longer than usual, decisions that deviated from the expected pattern, and cryptic messages that reached the council in the form of brief, almost imperceptible notes that hinted at uncertainty, reflection, and perhaps even a premonition of events yet to unfold. The night he vanished was unlike any other. The air carried a peculiar stillness, the kind that settles just before a storm, though the stars shone brilliantly above, indifferent to the stirring of fate below. The palace itself seemed to sense the weight of what was to come, its corridors echoing with the soft footfalls of guards, the hushed conversations of attendants, and the distant tolling of a bell marking the midnight hour. In the private chambers of the king, candlelight flickered upon the walls, casting long shadows that danced as if to a rhythm dictated by forces unseen, illuminating maps, scrolls, and artifacts that chronicled the kingdom's history, its victories, its losses, and the countless threads of human endeavor that had woven the tapestry of its present. There the king sat alone at his writing desk, a quill poised over parchment, pausing often to stare into the dim glow, as if listening for a voice carried upon the wind, an answer that never came. The attendants who tended to the chambers reported that, at precisely the stroke of midnight, the king rose and walked toward the balcony overlooking the outer courtyard. No one can say with certainty what he saw in the night beyond the walls, whether it was merely the familiar landscape, veiled in silver moonlight, or whether something hidden, ephemeral, and impossible to describe had caught his attention. Moments later, he was gone. His absence was discovered hours later when a morning inspection revealed the bed untouched, the chamber doors locked from within, and no trace of the king anywhere in the palace. Guards scoured every passageway, every tower, every hidden corridor, yet no hint of him emerged. Windows were found closed, gates remained sealed. Even the animals of the palace, usually attuned to disturbance, were silent, as if complicit in the enigma that had taken the sovereign from sight. News of his disappearance rippled through the kingdom like a shockwave, leaving ministers, generals, and citizens alike in a state of profound confusion and unease. The council convened immediately, debating whether to declare an emergency, summon distant allies, or search for answers in texts long forgotten. Yet even as strategies were discussed and plans drafted, a sense of futility permeated the air. There was a silent understanding that the king's disappearance was no ordinary event, that it might not be explainable by human reason or by the natural laws that had governed the kingdom for centuries. Outside the palace walls, rumors grew. Some claimed that the king had been taken by unseen forces, spirits of the forests, or guardians of the hidden mountains. Others suggested he had undertaken a secret journey, seeking knowledge or truth so profound that it required vanishing from the eyes of all who knew him. Traders returning from distant roads spoke of strange occurrences, rivers that shimmered with unnatural light, animals behaving oddly, and winds carrying whispers of commands or warnings no one could interpret. The disappearance transformed the kingdom's rhythm. Streets that had once thrummed with the cadence of daily life fell quiet as fear and speculation intertwined. Markets were subdued. The usual laughter and chatter of citizens gave way to hushed tones and glances toward the palace. In the courts and halls where justice had been dispensed without fail, deliberations now carried a note of tension and uncertainty. Scholars and chroniclers began to record the events meticulously, for they understood that history was unfolding in real time, yet the account they attempted to capture resisted definition, slipping like water through their fingers. Over the following days, search parties were dispatched, spanning the vast territories under the kingdom's control. They combed forests dense and uncharted, navigated winding rivers that hid treacherous currents, and ascended cliffs that defied human endeavor. Each expedition returned with fragments of observation, strange phenomena, or fleeting impressions, yet none could provide clarity or trace the vanished king. Diaries and journals collected from these excursions described oddities: lights that appeared and vanished without source, footprints that led nowhere, and the sensation, shared among many, of being watched by eyes unseen. The narrative of the king's disappearance began to grow into legend even before its resolution, for the sheer mystery captivated the imagination of all who heard it. Scholars debated whether it was deliberate concealment, a mystical occurrence, or an event that transcended ordinary understanding. The king's personal quarters were examined again and again, revealing subtle clues: a half-written note mentioning a distant place he had never spoken of, the faint scent of herbs unfamiliar to the kingdom, and a single, small key of unknown purpose. Yet even these remnants offered no definitive path to explanation. Stories began to emerge among the populace. Some insisted they had glimpsed the king wandering alone at dusk, beyond the palace gates, looking neither lost nor fearful, but serene and contemplative, almost as if he were following a path known only to him. Others whispered of dreams in which the king appeared, beckoning, conveying messages impossible to interpret, and vanishing upon awakening. This intersection of reality and perception only deepened the enigma, creating a tapestry of accounts that combined observation, memory, and imagination. Generations of chroniclers would later study these early reports, each attempt to reconstruct events revealing as much about the observers as about the king himself. The mystery of the disappearance was compounded by the kingdom's reliance on intricate systems of governance and communication. Messengers sent to neighboring realms reported only empty roads, abandoned posts, and in some instances, cryptic symbols etched onto tree trunks or walls, the meaning of which eluded interpretation. Some symbols resembled patterns seen in the king's personal artifacts, while others seemed entirely foreign, suggesting an intelligence operating beyond the comprehension of ordinary human design. Within the palace, life attempted to continue, but the absence of the sovereign created an invisible void that affected every aspect of existence. Laws could still be enacted, markets could still operate, yet a pervasive tension lingered, subtle but persistent, as if the kingdom itself awaited the king's return or a revelation that might never come. Those closest to him, the royal advisors, generals, and attendants, found themselves haunted by uncertainty. Decisions were second-guessed, whispers of doubt and fear echoed through chambers that had known certainty for decades, and sleep became an elusive luxury for those tasked with maintaining the continuity of the realm. Historians and storytellers of the era, observing from the periphery, began to draw connections between the king's disappearance and unusual occurrences that had preceded it. Seasons seemed to shift unpredictably, rivers swelled without cause, and animals migrated along unfamiliar routes. Some speculated that the king's vanishing was inextricably linked to these phenomena, that perhaps his departure had disturbed a delicate balance between the kingdom and the natural forces surrounding it. Others were more cautious, noting that correlation did not imply causation, yet even the most skeptical could not dismiss the profound strangeness of the circumstances. As weeks turned into months, the narrative of the vanished king solidified into a framework of collective memory. Songs, poems, and chronicles began to weave together, blending fact and interpretation, observation and imagination. Each telling offered a slightly different perspective, emphasizing different elements: the serenity of his final night, the eeriness of his disappearance, the heroic efforts to find him, or the subtle hints left behind that suggested a purpose beyond immediate comprehension. Yet through all accounts, one element remained constant: the king had vanished, leaving behind only fragments, impressions, and unanswered questions that would endure for generations. Scholars, explorers, and philosophers debated the nature of disappearance itself, using the event as a lens to explore human understanding, perception, and the limitations of knowledge. Was the vanishing of the king a literal physical absence, or did it represent a metaphysical journey inaccessible to ordinary observation? Could it be that in seeking to understand his disappearance, humanity uncovered as much about itself as it might about the missing sovereign? The story, though grounded in the events of a singular night, expanded outward, touching every corner of the kingdom, influencing thought, behavior, and the very fabric of culture. And while the search continued, a quiet consensus emerged among those most closely involved. Some mysteries were perhaps not meant to be solved, that the king's absence, enigmatic as it was, might carry lessons and truths beyond the immediate realm of human reasoning, serving as a reminder of the fragile line between knowledge and uncertainty, between presence and absence, between history recorded and history imagined. As the kingdom grappled with the enigmatic absence of its sovereign, expeditions were organized with meticulous precision, spanning the farthest reaches of the realm, from mist-laden valleys to jagged mountain ridges whose peaks pierced clouds. Yet even in these remote and forbidding landscapes, the king's trail seemed to dissolve into nothingness. The search parties, composed of skilled trackers, soldiers, and scholars familiar with every contour of the land, moved in calculated formations, consulting maps that had been refined over generations, yet they encountered obstacles and anomalies that defied rational explanation. Forests, once known for their predictable paths and patterns, appeared to shift subtly, as though the land itself conspired to obscure their progress, leaving familiar landmarks distorted or entirely absent. Rivers, normally placid and well-charted, revealed hidden currents and sudden whirlpools that seemed to spring from nowhere, carrying boats off course and forcing teams to turn back. Birds and other wildlife exhibited unusual behaviors. Flocks altered their migration routes dramatically. Animals observed the search parties with uncanny awareness, and a silence often fell upon the surroundings, as though some unseen presence monitored each step. Within the palace, scholars and seers meticulously examined the fragments left behind by the king, analyzing his notes, sketches, and personal items for clues. Among these remnants, a series of obscure symbols stood out, geometric patterns that repeated across parchment, carved into the edges of furniture, and faintly etched upon objects that had been in his possession for years. Their meaning remained elusive, provoking endless speculation. Some posited that these symbols formed a map of intangible locations, guiding the king toward a destination hidden from ordinary perception, a place accessible only through intuition, insight, or perhaps courage of a type the common citizen could scarcely imagine. Meanwhile, within the hearts of the kingdom's people, the story of the missing sovereign took on a life of its own. Travelers returning from distant towns brought accounts of sightings, some fleeting and impossible to verify. A cloaked figure glimpsed walking along a riverbank at dusk, a shadow moving silently across the summit of a mountain, lights flickering in forests where no fire should have burned, each observation adding layers to a narrative increasingly indistinguishable from legend. Scholars convened in dimly lit halls to debate the implications. Was the king truly absent from the material world, or had he merely chosen to withdraw into secrecy, observing the kingdom from a distance? Could his disappearance signify a deliberate act? A strategic move whose purpose would only be revealed in time, or was it something more profound, a crossing of boundaries that human understanding could barely approach? In parallel, the natural world seemed to respond to the absence with subtle, yet unmistakable changes. Seasons arrived out of sync, blooms appeared unexpectedly and vanished just as suddenly, and storms gathered in patterns that no meteorologist could anticipate. Observers noted these occurrences with a mixture of fascination and apprehension, interpreting them as either coincidence, portent, or the echo of a sovereign whose presence had somehow intertwined with the rhythms of the land itself. As months passed, the kingdom developed a new layer of culture around the mystery. Artists, musicians, and poets captured the king's vanishing in works that conveyed both reverence and fear, weaving imagery of twilight forests, endless corridors, and distant silhouettes into tapestries and melodies. These creations, while beautiful, reinforced the sense that the event transcended ordinary experience, inspiring awe and contemplation, and nurturing an almost meditative fascination with the unknown. Meanwhile, accounts from the search parties became increasingly strange and perplexing. Some reported seeing objects suspended midair, as if gravity itself had momentarily lost its hold. Others described hearing voices that seemed to echo commands, warnings, or fragments of language entirely unfamiliar. At times, entire landscapes appeared to shift overnight. A familiar ridge would appear in a new location, or a riverbed would reroute itself inexplicably, leaving behind sedimentary patterns that baffled even the most experienced geographers. These phenomena, while sporadic, were consistent enough to suggest that the king's disappearance was not merely an isolated event, but part of a larger, perhaps cosmic, sequence that exceeded the comprehension of those tasked with resolving it. Within the palace, the council grew both desperate and reflective. Meetings stretched long into the night, often punctuated by moments of silence as members contemplated the implications of their sovereign's absence. The question of leadership became delicate. No decree could match the authority of the king, yet the kingdom required governance. Interim measures were adopted, systems reinforced, and decisions debated with extraordinary caution, each action weighed for its potential impact on stability, morale, and the unfolding enigma. As the search extended into more remote and uncharted territories, some parties reported phenomena that defied conventional explanation entirely. Echoes of footsteps that seemed to approach from no direction, flickering lights in the forest canopy that vanished when pursued, and fleeting glimpses of a figure that moved with an impossible fluidity, created a sense of otherworldliness that penetrated even the most rational minds. Journals from these expeditions describe moments when observers felt a presence beyond observation, a consciousness that seemed aware of their intentions, guiding or testing them in ways they could not articulate. At the same time, subtle patterns emerged. The symbols left by the king, when traced carefully and overlaid with the geography of the realm, appeared to form sequences resembling constellations, river currents, and mountain formations. Analysts speculated that these markings were not random, but encoded instructions, perhaps leading toward knowledge, insight, or a revelation that could illuminate the nature of his disappearance. Yet deciphering these sequences proved arduous, demanding patience, imagination, and a willingness to embrace ambiguity. As the kingdom continued its patient search, the people adapted in both conscious and unconscious ways. Rituals developed around the story of the vanished king, not out of superstition, but as a collective acknowledgement of uncertainty, the human need for narrative, and the desire to remain connected to the figure who had governed and inspired them. Every festival, song, and story incorporated elements of the mystery, reinforcing the sense that life and legend were intertwined. Scholars, too, began to explore philosophical implications. Was the disappearance of a sovereign a literal absence, or did it challenge the very concepts of presence, authority, and time? Could one person's vanishing reveal limitations in perception, understanding, or the human propensity to impose order upon a world that, at times, defies categorization? Each discussion, lecture, or treatise added layers to the ever-expanding tapestry of interpretation surrounding the king, transforming a singular event into a study of consciousness, society, and the interplay between knowledge and enigma. In this period, extraordinary efforts were undertaken to communicate with the unseen. Explorers, chroniclers, and mages, or those skilled in the art of observation and understanding, attempted methods ranging from symbolic correspondence to careful observation of environmental patterns. Messages were left in hidden locations, intended for the king or for those who might interpret his intent, yet responses were never confirmed. The very act of sending these messages reflected a blend of hope, faith in intellect, and the acknowledgement that some truths exist beyond direct perception. Stories continued to emerge from the fringes of society. Travelers claimed that villages along remote roads had seen shadows moving in perfect synchrony, lights flickering in uninhabited towers, and figures appearing atop hills only to vanish when approached. These accounts, though anecdotal, became part of the collective consciousness, influencing the culture, art, and moral framework of the kingdom. Observers noticed that the kingdom itself seemed to adapt to the ongoing mystery. Governance shifted subtly, commerce evolved to accommodate uncertainty, and citizens developed a heightened awareness of the impermanence of certainty itself. In private, those who had known the king intimately reported feelings of connection, as if their memories and shared experiences allowed them to sense his presence despite physical absence. This perception, though impossible to verify, became a source of comfort, inspiration, and sometimes unease. As time progressed, the boundary between history and myth began to blur. Accounts, diaries, and artistic interpretations wove together in a narrative that was at once historical and allegorical. The vanished king became not only a subject of inquiry, but also a symbol, a reminder of human limitation, the allure of mystery, and the perpetual tension between what is known and what remains beyond comprehension. In these months, the kingdom witnessed phenomena that would later be chronicled in tomes of observation, analysis, and reflection. Rivers that glowed faintly under moonlight, patterns in the wind that traced symbols across plains, and animals behaving with uncharacteristic precision all suggested an underlying order, a hidden choreography that, while elusive, hinted at a connection between the king's disappearance and the broader natural world. Investigators recorded these occurrences meticulously, documenting anomalies with care, yet always acknowledging the impossibility of absolute certainty. The search for the king also inspired innovation. Scholars and engineers devised instruments to track subtle environmental changes, develop maps that accounted for shifting landscapes, and observe patterns invisible to the naked eye. These creations, born from necessity, would influence knowledge for generations, demonstrating that even in the face of incomprehensible events, human curiosity and determination can produce insight, ingenuity, and progress. As the search for the vanished king extended into its second year, the kingdom had begun to take on a rhythm shaped by absence, anticipation, and the subtle influence of forces never fully understood. Investigators and chroniclers devoted themselves to interpreting the symbols, notes, and faint traces the king had left behind, analyzing them with a precision that bordered on obsession. Some symbols, when studied in sequence, suggested patterns that mimicked the flow of wind across the plains or the movement of stars in the night sky, hinting that the king had perhaps sought a path beyond ordinary human perception, a journey that intersected with both the tangible and the ineffable. Explorers reported further anomalies, doors that led to hidden chambers not marked on any map, corridors that seemed longer or shorter depending on the observer, and mirrors that reflected spaces that did not exist within the confines of the palace. These occurrences, while baffling, were treated with meticulous documentation, as if the very act of recording them might reveal some underlying order or logic, some explanation for the king's disappearance that remained just out of reach. In remote corners of the kingdom, travelers spoke of fleeting glimpses, a figure appearing atop a ridge at dawn, a a shadow passing silently through a forest, or a whisper carried by the wind that suggested awareness, presence, and perhaps intention. These reports, though anecdotal, became integrated into the growing tapestry of legend, contributing to a sense that the king's absence was not merely a physical event, but an interaction with the very fabric of the realm. Within the palace, the council began to recognize that the disappearance had initiated a transformation of governance and perception. Decisions were made with an unprecedented caution, acknowledging both the limitations of human understanding and the possibility that some outcomes were influenced by unseen or unknowable forces. Advisors spoke in measured tones, always aware that each choice might resonate in ways impossible to foresee, echoing the mystery that had enveloped their sovereign. Scholars devoted themselves to the philosophical dimensions of the king's absence, exploring questions that extended beyond the immediate search. Was it possible that the king had crossed a threshold between reality and an alternate perception, or even between the physical and the symbolic? Could absence itself carry meaning, shaping society, thought, and culture in subtle yet profound ways? These questions were debated in private chambers, in public forums, and in written treatises, creating a discourse that transformed the kingdom into a realm of contemplation, observation, and speculative inquiry. Artists, inspired by the persistent enigma, created works that captured both beauty and uncertainty. Paintings depicted forests bathed in silver light, towers that stretched impossibly toward the sky, and silhouettes of figures disappearing into mist. Music echoed with melodies that rose and fell unpredictably, invoking emotions that ranged from quiet reflection to awe and reverence. Each work contributed to the kingdom's evolving identity, blending lived experience with interpretation, and grounding collective memory in both reality and imagination. Meanwhile, explorers and search parties continued their journeys into territories that challenged both skill and perception. Some described phenomena that defied logic entirely, paths that looped back on themselves, cliffs that seemed taller than possible, and light that shifted in ways inconsistent with ordinary understanding. Observers frequently recorded sensations of being guided or observed by unseen intelligence, a presence that remained just beyond comprehension. These encounters, though disturbing to some, were meticulously chronicled, preserving the accounts for posterity and contributing to the growing narrative that the king's disappearance was an event of extraordinary consequence, both tangible and metaphysical. In the daily life of the kingdom, the impact of the absence became increasingly subtle yet pervasive. Citizens developed practices and rituals that acknowledged uncertainty and reinforced collective resilience. Marketplaces operated under quiet awareness that the ordinary could be touched by the extraordinary at any moment. Families told stories of the vanished king, not only recounting events but imparting lessons about patience, observation, and the limits of understanding. Even children learned to perceive the world with heightened attention, noting patterns, changes, and anomalies that adults might overlook. As months turned into years, the narrative surrounding the king evolved into a framework of both cultural and intellectual significance. Scholars drew parallels between his disappearance and natural phenomena, speculating that certain events, unexplained floods, sudden shifts in weather, or alterations in animal behavior, might be subtly connected to the king's journey. Explorers tested hypotheses, mapping anomalies and comparing observations across regions, yet no definitive pattern emerged. The ambiguity itself became a central feature of the kingdom's understanding of reality, that some forces, events, and truths might exist beyond immediate human perception, shaping experience in ways that could be sensed but never fully defined. In rare moments, fragments of insight seemed to emerge. A map discovered in a hidden chamber suggested a location deep within an uncharted forest, marked with symbols identical to those left by the king. Observers who attempted to reach the area reported sensations of vertigo, disorientation, and fleeting visions, as if the landscape itself resisted intrusion. Trees appeared to shift subtly, streams altered their courses overnight, and the very air carried a peculiar charge, heightening awareness and perception. Yet even when these locations were approached, no trace of the king was found, leaving only questions, impressions, and the quiet certainty that something extraordinary had transpired. The kingdom's scholars, philosophers, and chroniclers began to explore the disappearance as a metaphor as well as a historical event. Absence was recognized as a force that shaped thought, society, and perception. Observing what was no longer present became a method for understanding what had been, what could be, and what might lie beyond ordinary experience. Discussions ranged from practical concerns, such as governance and continuity, to the nature of consciousness, memory, and the limits of knowledge itself. Tales of the king's last night, the symbolic messages he left behind, and the phenomena encountered by searchers became the subject of teaching, reflection, and artistic interpretation. Students of observation were trained to notice subtleties in environment, behavior, and light, cultivating awareness of patterns and connections that might otherwise remain hidden. Music, visual art, and literature evolved to express not only the mystery of absence, but the emotional and psychological resonance it carried. The king, though physically gone, became a living presence in the kingdom's intellectual and cultural life, a symbol of the profound interplay between knowledge, perception, and the unknowable. Occasionally, reports reached the palace of extraordinary encounters in the outer territories, glowing lights moving with apparent purpose, footsteps heard in abandoned areas, or shadows cast without identifiable source. These phenomena, while difficult to verify, were treated with respect and careful recording, adding to the complex mosaic of evidence, theory, and legend. Each account, each observation, reinforced the sense that the king's disappearance was a catalyst for discovery, reflection, and transformation, influencing thought in ways that extended far beyond the immediate question of his physical location. The search for understanding inspired new methods of inquiry, instruments for observation, and frameworks for interpreting patterns in the natural and symbolic world. Scholars developed techniques for correlating environmental anomalies with symbolic data, creating systems of analysis that, while unable to provide absolute answers, offered insight into the kingdom's unfolding mystery. Explorers and chroniclers became adept at navigating both tangible landscapes and the subtle dimensions of perception, cultivating skills that transcended ordinary human experience. Over time, the disappearance of the king became central to the kingdom's identity, a defining moment that shaped values, practices, and cultural memory. The story of absence, observation, and subtle influence permeated daily life, education, governance, and art, reinforcing an awareness of the delicate interplay between certainty and ambiguity. Citizens learned to observe carefully, to question assumptions, and to recognize the profound consequences of even the smallest actions. Legends arose not to provide simple answers, but to encourage reflection, patience, and openness to experience beyond the immediately observable. As decades passed, the vanished king became a figure of enduring fascination. Scholars compiled volumes of observations, explorers recorded patterns of anomaly, and artists captured visions that blended reality with imagination. The kingdom evolved into a place where mystery was embraced, absence was acknowledged as a powerful force, and the search for understanding, whether literal or symbolic, shaped every aspect of cultural and intellectual life. Even in the absence of resolution, the king's disappearance catalyzed insight, creativity, and awareness, establishing a legacy far beyond the physical confines of his presence. As the years stretched into decades, the vanished king's presence, paradoxically, remained tangible in ways far more profound than any physical existence could have ensured. Scholars, chroniclers, and artists, bound by the shared pursuit of understanding, continued to examine the subtle threads that had emerged from the initial disappearance, recognizing that absence itself had become a catalyst for insight, growth, and the evolution of human perception. In lecture halls and libraries, texts were studied with extraordinary care. Treatises debated the interplay between observation, intuition, and the hidden dimensions of reality, positing that the king's vanishing had revealed not only the limits of human comprehension, but the immense potential for awareness, contemplation, and creativity when confronted with the unknown. Explorers and those who traversed the kingdom's wild and uncharted lands spoke of landscapes subtly transformed, pathways that seemed to appear only to those who moved with attentiveness, and phenomena that defied expectation. Streams flowed with patterns that hinted at design, winds whispered faint messages among the trees, and light itself revealed intricate reflections and shadows that seemed almost purposeful. These experiences, while mysterious, encouraged careful observation, mindfulness, and a deepened sense of connection between humans and the world they inhabited. The kingdom itself underwent a quiet transformation. Governance became more reflective, policies more adaptive, and society cultivated patience and observation as virtues of equal importance to courage and skill. The story of the vanished king became a living framework for decision-making, teaching generations to weigh consequences carefully, recognize subtle signals in their environment, and approach challenges with both humility and imagination. Art and culture flourished, inspired by the interplay of absence and presence. Poets composed verses that traced the movements of wind, water, and shadow, weaving the vanished king into allegorical narratives that explored perception, influence, and the tension between the known and unknown. Musicians created compositions that emulated the rhythms of unseen forces, the ebb and flow of discovery, and the quiet anticipation of insight that never fully revealed itself. Visual artists captured fleeting impressions of landscapes imbued with the essence of mystery, portraying forests, rivers, and towers not as they were, but as they felt, merging observation with imagination to evoke contemplation and emotional resonance. Among citizens, awareness of impermanence and subtlety became ingrained. Children learned to observe patterns in nature, adults attuned themselves to nuances of behavior and environment, and communities developed rituals of reflection and storytelling that honored both what was seen and what was suggested, both tangible experience and the unseen threads that shaped life. Generations later, the vanished king became emblematic of the profound interplay between reality and perception. The mystery of his absence was no longer solely a question of location or circumstance, but a lens through which the kingdom examined its own understanding, creativity, and adaptability. Absence, it was understood, could instruct as powerfully as presence. Mystery could inspire as effectively as clarity, and the limits of comprehension could provoke curiosity, imagination, and humility. Philosophers reflected that the king's disappearance revealed a universal truth, that life, knowledge, and experience are shaped as much by what is hidden as by what is revealed. Observation and reflection, patience and insight, awareness and contemplation, all became central pillars of the kingdom's identity, shaped not by the tangible presence of a leader, but by the enduring resonance of an event that refused to yield easy answers. Legends persisted, whispered along roads, sung in taverns, and inscribed in journals. Every account emphasized the complexity of experience, the subtle interplay of cause and effect, and the humility required to navigate a world where certainty could not always be attained. Even the most meticulous scholars acknowledged the limits of their understanding, embracing ambiguity as a source of wisdom rather than frustration. In private moments, citizens recalled the stories of the vanished king with reverence and curiosity. They imagined him walking through distant forests, climbing mountains shrouded in mist, or contemplating landscapes beyond ordinary perception. These imaginings fostered a sense of wonder, a belief in the value of exploration, both outward into the world and inward into the mind, and an understanding that the pursuit of knowledge is often as meaningful as its attainment. The vanished king's story became an enduring study in paradox, teaching that influence need not require presence, that guidance can occur through subtle traces, and that the interplay of mystery and understanding is a force capable of shaping societies, thought, and culture across generations. Over time, the kingdom emerged not merely as a political entity, but as a living testament to resilience, adaptation, and the transformative power of observation and reflection. The vanished king, though never seen again, was woven into the very fabric of its identity, an invisible architect of insight, creativity, and philosophy. His absence became a presence, a narrative, and a mirror for the human condition, a reminder that the world contains layers beyond immediate perception, that uncertainty can inspire growth, and that mysteries, once encountered, leave an indelible mark on consciousness, imagination, and culture. In the final reckoning, the king's disappearance was understood not as a failure, loss, or tragedy, but as a profound event that revealed the latent potential within human awareness. Generations of citizens, explorers, and scholars carried forward lessons encoded in his absence: to observe carefully, to question assumptions, to embrace uncertainty with patience and humility, and to recognize the beauty and complexity of a world that does not yield all its truths at once. And so the kingdom persisted, guided not by the visible hand of its sovereign, but by the invisible resonance of an event that transcended ordinary explanation. Across forests, rivers, and mountains, across bustling towns and silent valleys, the spirit of inquiry, reflection, and attentive observation endured, a living legacy of a sovereign whose journey, though hidden, reshaped the consciousness of a people and left an imprint upon time itself. The vanished king, never recovered, became eternal, an emblem of the subtle power of absence, the enduring mystery of existence, and the infinite possibilities that arise when curiosity, imagination, and reflection are embraced. His story, recorded in countless accounts, immortalized in art and music, and contemplated in the hearts and minds of those who lived and learned in his kingdom, remained a guiding force. A narrative that transcended the limitations of ordinary life, encouraging all who encountered it to consider the profound, to respect the unknowable, and to find meaning not only in what is revealed, but in the quiet, enduring lessons left by that which is unseen, untraceable, and extraordinary.